Thanks so much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, there are celebrations in the Somali capital. After long-delayed elections returned former leader Hassan Mohamud as president. He'll have to tackle deep political fractures, devastating drought and a violent insurgency when he takes over. Also, a tanker carrying Russian oil docks in a South African port, raising opposition questions about whether the cargo is to be offloaded. Pretoria has refused to take sides over the war in Ukraine as global sanctions on Russia mount. And after months of fatal protests against a military takeover and worsening economic conditions, young Sudanese find respite from the turmoil by finding refuge in art and music. But first, Somalia has been congratulated on electing former President Hassan Mohamud as its next leader. Sunday's polls had been long delayed, and Mahmoud's predecessor, Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed, the current president's term, technically ended in February 2021 without an election. Laurent Berstecker has more.
Congratulated by his main rival and predecessor, Somalia's new president is already looking ahead.
Let us think about tomorrow, not yesterday and what happened. I will work on a brilliant tomorrow and a beautiful future for the sake of my people.
It will be Hassan Sheikh Mohamud's second stint at the head of the country after serving a first presidential mandate from 2012 to 2017. During his first tenure, the former academic forged a reputation as a peace-loving moderate, but his term was sullied by corruption accusations. He now inherits a highly volatile and unstable country, which faces a jihadist insurrection, a historic drought, and a spiraling economic crisis. As many challenges that the new Somali president will have to tackle, while attempting to reconcile a fractured and divided political class.
He is a wise Somali elder who can work with all political parties.
I hope that he will create jobs for unemployed young people who live in harsh conditions.
Sunday's election marked the end of a year-long political crisis and should help reassure Somalia's international partners. On Monday, Joe Biden ordered the redeployment of hundreds of U.S. troops to the country to fight the Al-Shabaab insurgency.
Well, Omar Mahmoud is a senior analyst for Somalia at the International Crisis Group. I earlier asked him whether the U.S. plans to deploy troops to Somalia again. Is that likely to make much of a difference?
I don't think the announcement comes as that much of a surprise. I think when the former President Trump repositioned the Somali troops out, it really had more to do with domestic U.S. considerations around the end of his tenure rather than any changes in Somalia. And at the same time, you can argue that Al-Shabaab has been quite an emboldened actor over the past year and a half. As much of that has to do with, honestly, the election cycle more than anything related to the U.S. positioning. So I think it will definitely add a level of pressure to Al-Shabaab, but we should remember, Al-Shabaab has been a very active actor, even when U.S. troops and airstrikes were happening in the country on a regular basis beforehand. So we can't really look at this maybe as sort of a single, decision maker or game changer in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Now, Somalia's foreign partners in general were pretty concerned about the effect that the election delays had on the country's fight against Al-Shabaab. But internally, is security really the main concern going forward?
Well, security is definitely a concern, but, security is also a byproduct of political dysfunction at times. And we've had this election process that was so difficult to get off the ground. It comes 16 months delayed. It was so divisive. Grievances and political cleavages have either been exacerbated by this or new ones even completely opened by the process. And so I think, yes, security is part of the picture, but the wider picture is this always comes back to politics. And without some level of political reconciliation, I think it's going to be difficult to make progress, not just on security, but a range of other fronts. But of course, security being one of those most affected by fractured politics.
Now, Mahmoud was president between 2012 and 2017. Do you see that familiarity he has with that role as being of benefit to him as he tries to kind of paper over or heal some of the political fractures that we've seen over the last years?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for Somalia because you have a new president, but for the first time also a president that's been there before. So in theory, that should make the lead-up time, the kind of familiarity time, getting on the ground running a bit shorter, given that he's already been there. But at the same time, of course, that means he comes with, already a reputation, already previous relationships, already maybe some baggage with those as well. So kind of overcoming from that will be quite interesting. But basically, it's an opportunity to take what he learned the first time around and really apply it better and use those lessons better going forward the second time.
And so what do you think his priorities will or should be going forward?
Well, I'd say there's two pressing immediate priorities. One is the humanitarian situation is quite dire right now. There's an ongoing drought, which could very much morph into a famine if not really addressed. And you've had a couple cycles of these in Somalia over the past decade, but the difference in terms of how bad they've gotten has always been if there's a good response, early mobilization. And because of the election cycle, we're a little late on that. The other is what I've already talked about here, the political reconciliation, which I think is really key going forward. There's technical tasks that need to be completed, finalizing the constitution, upholding the security forces, given the AU mission is drawing down, and even preparing the ground for future elections in terms of a way that they're a bit more open. But I don't think any of that's really that possible without the degree of political reconciliation that needs to take place.
Look now at some news in brief. A former justice minister has been chosen as the running mate for Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga. Martha Karua is the first female candidate on a major presidential ticket in the country. She ran for top office in 2013 and is known for her fierce condemnation of state corruption. Odinga's announcement came the day after his rival, Deputy President William Ruto, picked lawmaker Rigathi Gachagua as his running mate. Voting scheduled for August 9th. Around 40 people, many army civilian volunteers, have been killed in suspected extremist attacks in Burkina Faso. Around 25 people were killed in two assaults on Saturday, one at Gesel and another at Makwe. About 15 civilians were reportedly killed in Namuyuri on Saturday when their escorted convoy was attacked. Mali said that it's pulling out from the G5 Sahel Regional Counter-Terrorism Force. It includes soldiers from the neighbouring West African states of Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso and Chad. It was created in 2014 but only deployed troops in 2017. Many neighbouring states object to Mali's ruling junta, which seized power in August 2020. The country's grown increasingly isolated under widespread sanctions. Well, as calls for a boycott of Russian energy grow around the world, two tankers carrying Russian crude oil have entered South African waters. One docked in Saldanha Bay port on Sunday, and opposition figures in South Africa have called for clarification on whether any of the cargo is due to be offloaded. Pretoria has taken a neutral position on the war between Russia and Ukraine. Our Nadine Theron tells us more.
Two of the many ships sailing around the Cape coastline has attracted the interest of the South African public recently. These are two tankers carrying Russian crude oil. The first passed Cape Point last week and is headed to Cape Agulhas to the south of the peninsula. The second, the Ilandra Denadi, is believed to have 2 million barrels of Russian crude oil on board. It dropped anchor in Saldanha, about 100 kilometers north of Cape Town on Sunday. It's speculated that the cargo is destined for an oil storage facility in Saldanha that can hold up to 10 million barrels of oil. The big question is whether the Russian oil will be stored in South Africa or if it will be sold here. The South African government's neutral position to the war and its relationship with Russia has come under fire from the opposition party, whose leader recently visited Ukraine.
Well, I do think that South Africa has played directly into the hands of Russia in this regard, and that they're basically supporting a pariah state at this point. With the rest of the world ostracizing Russia and putting sanctions in place, South Africa should be following suit. Unfortunately, there is no legal impediment to South Africa or South African companies or even international companies operating in South Africa purchasing Russian oil. And as such, we have no legal means of stopping them. But from a moral perspective, I think that there is a moral obligation to say, whoa, enough, and to be transparent about it and to be open and honest about it.
The party has asked the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, to clarify the nature of this shipment in Parliament in the next few weeks. Meanwhile, Russian oil exports have declined by 14% and other countries are moving away from cargo carried on Russian ships.
Nadine Thera there for us. Now, amidst weekly protests and deteriorating economic conditions, young Sudanese have increasingly been turning to art and music to express themselves. For many, Khartoum's vibrant cultural scene has become a refuge, helping them forget the harsh conditions of the country's social and political turmoil.
Tuning the instruments and setting up the partitions before the choir steps on stage. In between two rounds of protests, these young Sudanese are turning to music to lift their spirits and spread a positive message.
Despite the wounded and the grim reality we face, we are still able to make people happy, to give even a small bit of hope through art.
Over the past 6 months, thousands of Sudanese have taken to the streets weekly to denounce a military coup that derailed the country's democratic transition. Authorities have responded with a violent security crackdown, fueling even more anger and resentment towards the regime. As bodies continue to pile up, with nearly 100 protesters killed since October, many young Sudanese are using art and music to drown their sorrows and fuel their revolutionary flame. This building was once used as a detention center by security forces. It was recently renovated and turned into a school by a collective of artists and activists who painted messages of hope on its walls.
We managed to make the place a tool for resistance. We turned it back into a school. Schools are part of the awareness of the next generations.
On top of the security crackdown, Sudan is also in the midst of an economic crisis. Faced with a bleak future, young Sudanese are increasingly seeking refuge in artistic expression.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
3 years ago, the images of the fire that engulfed the medieval church of Notre Dame in Paris made headlines around the world. After the initial shock, thousands of men and women, including architects, scientists, or painters, started working around the clock to restore the building to its former glory. Notre Dame Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.